introduction, and I should probably, just one sec, I just got a message. I just need to click on that. Yeah, well, thanks very much for inviting me. You may all wonder, how does a Prussian historian end up giving a talk on prisoners of war? And it's very simple. I've moved on from Prussia. Not entirely, but I've certainly expanded my focus. And I'm currently writing a book about the concept of honor and parole, and how parole as a custom sort of changed in the course of the 19th century, and why it disappeared in the 20th century, despite its utility. I should also acknowledge off the bat that I'm not really a medical historian per se, in that my interest rather lies with the humanitarian ideas and challenges that have informed wartime medicine. The purpose of my talk today is really to introduce you. Sorry, just before I continue, let me actually put up my slide. Just the joys of Zoom. Right, okay. So the purpose of my talk today is to really hone in onto meta discussions and to suggest ways in which we might make sense of the convergences, the differences, and paradoxes that they present. The first one concerns the telos of total war, and the other the agency of humanitarian emotions. In a nutshell, proponents of the concept of total war point to how technological innovations in weaponry, the rise of new ideologies, nationalism, new theories of race, and the general expansion of the powers of the state have served to exacerbate the destructive potential of war since the Age of Revolutions in the late 18th century. Between the American Revolutionary War and the end of the Second World War, Western armies learned to mobilize ever greater numbers of citizens through various models of compulsory service. Meanwhile, some see the introduction of steam-powered ironclads, experimental submarines, machine guns, breech-loading artillery, and the invention of the rifled minié ball in the mid-decades of the 19th century alone as evidence of how quickly change was leaving the quaint world of limited 18th century cabinet wars in the rear-view mirror. Historians and scholars of humanitarianism present a somewhat different perspective on this problem. They emphasize and indeed often celebrate the fact that the looming descent into an abyss of wanton destruction, fueled by national and racial hatreds, brought together a motley coalition of humanitarians, doctors, international lawyers, statesmen, pacifists, and utopians who were determined to rein in the specter of total war. To that end, the establishment of the International Committee of the Red Cross in 1863 and the adoption of the First Geneva Convention for the protection of wounded soldiers 1 year later set in motion an arduous process of multilateral negotiations that last to this day, which have tried to set rules that are binding for all combatants in war. Just as the mid-19th century was a stepping stone to the violence unleashed by the world wars, these decades were therefore also, in many ways, the takeoff of modern humanitarianism. Some scholars, following the lead of the sociologist Norbert Elias, have even gone so far as to posit that what they regard as a decline of interpersonal violence has made humans more rational, empathetic, and attuned to the rights of and innate dignity of our fellow citizens. A second area of debate, which overlaps in important respects with the issue of whether violence has declined, is the role of emotions as catalysts of action. While emotions are universal, scholars of the Enlightenment emphasize the heightened importance that feelings assumed in the 18th century. Social prescriptions modeled on courtly etiquette generated a countervailing culture of bourgeois sensibility. In France, salons, sentimental novels, and the flourishing of Freemasonry aimed specifically to cultivate feeling. William Reddy and others since have demonstrated, however, that the celebration of emotional authenticity created a feedback loop that radicalized opponents of the Bourbon regime in the late 1700s. The resulting terrors of the revolution led to a crisis of confidence in public displays of emotion. In Britain, too, many observers blamed the French Revolution on an excess of sentiment, prompting a backlash against overwrought displays of sentimentality. The mobilization of emotions in subsequent decades for humanitarian causes like the abolition of slavery and the amelioration of war-induced suffering was therefore beset by paradoxes. The Crimean War stands as a case in point. Correspondents like Howard Russell reported at length on the many travails of the Allied soldiers in the British press, which in turn brought Florence Nightingale and hundreds of other volunteer nurses to the Crimea to tend to the wounded in SIG. Based on an extensive analysis of contemporary literary depictions of the campaign in the Black Sea, my co-presenter Holly has demonstrated how these writings foregrounded British soldiers' dedication to fairness and specifically a chivalrous capacity for relieving the pain of others. However, the fighting in the Crimea often presented a stark contrast to this very romantic image. The Anglo-French, Turkish, Sardinian coalition forces that descended on the peninsula were no strangers to murder, rape, and looting, even going so far as to lay waste to the town of Kerch. Local civilians suffered particularly, yet their victimhood often remained marginal to the dominant focus on acts of mercy. And here I've just picked out a quote from the memoirs of an observer, which I think really brings out the violence and the sort of almost blasé attitude to death and to suffering was taking place in the Crimea. Now, what should have become clear from our overview of the two interrelated histories of total war and humanitarianism is that the Crimean War was in many respects liminal, not only as regards its place in the evolution of modern warfare, but also as regards the cultural role models that the protagonists drew on for orientation. At the center of my talk stands the question of how soldiers, statesmen, and civilians navigated this challenge. I argue that the way in which they compartmentalized emotions holds the key. The chivalrous desire to alleviate human misery was as much a choice suited to particular circumstances as the decision to ignore the effects of violence. More than ever, masculinities, be they geared towards humanitarianism or martial prowess, came to rest on effective control. It pays here to acknowledge the important distinction that psychologists, neuroscientists, and historians of emotion draw between empathy and compassion. Empathy tends to entail emotional transfers, whereby one person's pain or joy triggers the same feeling in somebody else. Compassion, by contrast, can be based on a strong desire to improve the situation of a suffering person without a requirement to feel what they do. It was compassion's accent on goal-oriented action that placed it right at the heart of 19th century humanitarianism and military concepts of honor. The sinking of the HMS Tiger and the fate of her crew offer an ideal case study to unpack the logic of what the French sociologist Didier Fassin terms humanitarian reason. Questions that are of particular interest in this context are, at which point did compassion replace enmity, and how did compassion in turn transform the relationship of former enemies? So with that, let me introduce the story of the Tiger. She was launched in 1849 and was first rated as a 1,200-ton sloop, but was later re-rated as a 16-gun second-class frigate in 1852. Though built of wood, she very much represented the cutting edge of contemporary shipbuilding and indeed technology. Her architect, the forward-looking John Eddy, had equipped the ship with a 400 horsepower steam engine that drove side paddle wheels. It can be seen very well here in the model. The conflict between Russia on the one side and Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire and Sardinia on the other had been building for quite some time. From a liberal West European perspective, Tsar Nicholas I's heavy-handed suppression of the 1831 Polish uprising and the 1848 revolution in Hungary, at the invitation of the Habsburgs, mind you, confirmed critics' image of Russia as a half-Asiatic, savage, authoritarian other that threatened the attainments of civilization. Mixed into this Russophobia were fears that Russia would expand further at the expense of the ailing Ottoman Empire, bringing her into conflict with France's and Britain's imperial interests. The suspicions of British and French Russophobe opinion were reciprocated, for Nicholas too grew concerned that the Western powers might outmaneuver him in the Balkans and in his role as protector of Christians in the Ottoman Empire. This backdrop to the outbreak of the Crimean War is necessary to understand the hostile frame of mind in which the parties entered the fray. When the Russian authorities in Odessa fired on sailors trying to collect the British consul and other British subjects under a flag of truce, a combined Anglo-French punitive expedition under the command of Vice Admiral Sir James Dundas responded to this violation of customary international law with an even more questionable, you might even say draconic reprisal. In what clearly was not one of the greatest actions in the annals of either navy, as one historian has put it, 6 British and 3 French vessels returned to Odessa on the 22nd of April 1854 to shell the town, despite its large civilian population. Having succeeded in destroying most of the fortifications, as can be seen very well in the images here, Dundas's units reconnoitered the coastline over the coming weeks in order to deal a similar blow to Sevastopol. During one of these forays, the Tiger became separated from her consuls in thick fog and on the 12th of May ran aground near the town that had earlier suffered the wrath of her cannons. To prevent the Tiger from escaping and probably also to exact revenge, local field artillery soon took aim from the cliffs above the stricken ship. As those images show, the Tiger and her crew took devastating hits as ladies with parasols and other civilians looked passively on from the cliffs above. The Tiger surgeon would later record in his medical journal, and here I would above all like to draw your attention to the highlighted bit where he says where he emphasizes the defenseless nature of defenseless situation of the Tiger. So in this, really precarious situation, Captain Henry Wells Giffard, who had lost both legs in the cannonade, recognized the futility of further resistance and gave the order to surrender. Up to this moment, the fighting had been conducted with very little civility. If anything, the two sides were caught in a downward spiral of aggression. Tellingly, the Russian authorities neither offered the defenseless Tiger the opportunity to surrender before the artillery barrage from the top of the cliff, nor did the crew demanded. We know from reports that the inability to defend their ship and the humiliation of having to ask for Russian clemency added a sense of shame to officers' emotional distress. To complicate matters further, the crew was unsure of what fate awaited them. The prospective captives and their captors had to contend with mutual ignorance of each other's customs. Being unacquainted with the Russian character, as one observer put it, the British officers defaulted to an expectation of ill treatment and hid their valuables. After the discovery of a decapitated corpse aboard the wreck, the regional military commander, General Baron Dimitri von Osten-Sacken, assumed for his part that this was simply how the Royal Navy punished incompetent pilots. In many ways, Osten-Sacken was a poster child of the Russian autocracy so despised by liberal public opinion in the United Kingdom. During the Polish insurrection of 1830 and 1831, he had inflicted defeats on the rebels and in 1849 helped to stamp out the Hungarian Revolution. However, no sooner had the Tiger surrendered than the story took an unexpected turn. Instead of antagonizing their defeated enemies further, the Russian authorities and civilian population of Odessa went out of their way to confound the 226 prisoners with acts of human kindness. Following a period of uncomfortable quarantine for the prisoners, ordinary crew members received spacious accommodations in a repurposed school, plentiful food rations, and, without prompting, new greatcoats. Even musical instruments were supplied. The curiosity of the Odessans brought other welcome relief as well. Female townsfolk threw flower bouquets over the walls, which established, as one newspaper reporter put it, a telegraphic communication by signs and the language of flowers. The officers profited from the attentions of their hosts more still. Parole permitted them to move about freely in the company of guards and chaperones, whose presence did not deter the French-speaking elites of Odessa from inviting the captives to soirees. As one commentator put it, these parties would keep up till 3 o'clock in the morning, dancing with the belles of Odessa and regaled on champagne suppers. Whatever communicative barriers may have existed, gestures of compassion, moral refinement, and gratitude acted as a powerful non-verbal icebreaker. Importantly, though, emotional bonding was a choice for men of honor rather than a mandate. Osten-Sacken suave transition from ruthlessness while the Tiger posed a military threat to compassion once his foes had been vanquished illustrates the diametrically opposed emotional responses soldiers of this period were capable of. We must not assume that one was more genuine than the other. British accounts are effusive in their praise for the authenticity of Osten-Sacken's compassion as he made daily visits to the wounded crew members of the Tiger, prayed for the souls of the dead, and consoled the dying Captain Giffard that he, as he put it, had nobly performed his part under the most trying circumstances, having manfully exerted himself to defend his ship in a position whence nothing short of a miracle could have extricated him. Osten-Sacken's wife, furthermore, sent food from her table to the prisoners, gifted to the mother of a young deceased midshipman a gold locket with a lock of his hair, and paid out of her own pocket for an iron railing on the grave of a 14-year-old powder boy. To the spouse of the unfortunate captain, she sent a letter expressing a genuine interest in her family's welfare and asked to be kept abreast of family news. Extensive anthropological theorizing that builds on the work of Georg Zimmer, Marcel Mauss, and Claude Lévi-Strauss has highlighted the reciprocal dynamics that generosity tends to foster. Material and spiritual gifts put the recipient in the benefactor's stead, which was something the prisoners were well aware of. Baroness Osten-Sacken's kindness will never be forgotten by any of us, the second master of the Tiger vowed after his release from captivity. The rest of the crew was similarly effusive or appreciative of the kindness bestowed on them. There's ample proof that the generosity of the Odessans was encouraged at the highest levels of government, the Russian government. Quarantine restrictions were waived so Mrs. Giffard could take a Royal Navy ship from Malta to see her dying husband. Although the ship arrived too late for the anxiously awaited reunion, the Tsar ordered the return of the captain's sword as a tribute to his personal bravery in serious injuries. The so honored, moreover, received a full state funeral, which all of Odessa's generals and officers attended. When shortly thereafter the Tiger's officers were split up and sent to different towns, the young midshipmen went to Moscow to allow them to continue their academic studies at the local university. The Tsar finally summoned Royer to St. Petersburg for an audience. At the end of a series of meetings with the monarch and other dignitaries, during which Royer received the present of a sword, War Minister Vasily A. Dolgorukov disclosed with surprising candor the objective of this imperial charm offensive. The goal, as the minister said, was to show that Russians were not such barbarians as the foreign papers had represented them. Tsar Nicholas and his successor, Alexander II, could afford to be magnanimous because the number of prisoners held by the Russians in the Crimean War was low. Attention to their welfare promised to win Russia foreign sympathies at modest cost. In a reversal of feelings that was every bit as dramatic as Osten-Sacken's, it is noticeable how quickly and comprehensively gratitude replaced the Tiger crew's previous concern with retribution and defiance. In turn, they shared a changed view of Russia with a British public eager for news from the campaign in the Crimea. And here on the screen, you can see an example. Royer, the surviving senior officer, commanding officer of the Tiger, penned memoirs, which, as you can see when you look closely, were actually published in 1854. So right in the middle of the Crimean War, while the fighting was still ongoing. Now, the unprecedented speed of postal services in the Crimean War reduced the delivery of letters to mere weeks. And so letters, or even the memoirs published during the war, could exert a real influence while the outcome of the war still hung in the balance. That the Tsar would even treat a lowly prisoner lieutenant to an audience and shower him with signs of imperial favor sent a political signal. If the totalizing logic, to borrow John Horn's phrase, of the later world wars favored strict reciprocity in the treatment of captives, Nicholas's gesture followed an older tradition that was born out of Russia's long history of conflict with the Ottoman Empire. The presentation of expensive gifts to select low-ranking captives by the Tsar was a symbolic gesture to ensure that Russian prisoners would be well looked after rather than killed. Systematic acts of murder had exacerbated Russo-Ottoman wars often enough before the advent of European humanitarian law. Royer was likely unaware of this cultural context. At the same time, he did not inquire too much into the reasons for his summons to St. Petersburg. The style of his memoirs instead owed something to earlier captivity narratives so ably analyzed by Linda Colley. Like the turban-wearing and hookah-smoking British survivors of Major General William Elphinstone's ill-fated expeditionary force, who were held for 9 months in Afghanistan in 1842, Royer acculturated fast to his new surroundings. For one, Russian compassion led the lieutenant to comment that the conduct of our civilized enemies afforded a striking contrast to that of our barbarous Ottoman allies, to whose assistance our country has generously proceeded. Such comments, as you can imagine, did not really play that well in Britain, where the partisanship of the Tiger's crew for Russia put in doubt the crew's patriotism. As Royer was the leader by seniority, his Russophile memoir met especially scathing scrutiny. Doubtless there are many kind warm hearts in Russia. A daily news reviewer summarized his verdict of the book, but Englishmen will not readily be brought to admire Russian despotism, however much a naval lieutenant with a strong dash of the tuft hunter in his composition may say in its favor. In the eyes of his detractors, the lieutenant's deculturation stemmed at best from naivete and sentimental exuberance. At worst, it signified disloyalty to his country. After the prisoners returned from Russia, Royer would receive one more posting before taking early retirement in 1857. So to conclude, I guess we can draw several lessons from the experiences of the Tiger's crew. Firstly, the variability of emotions displayed by both sides throws into relief that extreme violence and the humanitarian instinct to ease suffering were far from mutually exclusive in the Crimean War. Switches between the two were in part situational, but also reflected macroscopic calculations of national interest. Emotion and reason went hand in hand. The display of emotional authenticity, which had meant so much to proponents of sensibility in the 18th century, had thus become restrained, goal-oriented, and highly compartmentalized by the 1850s. At the same time, the interactions of the prisoners and their captors showed that humanitarianism served to create a sense of moral and emotional indebtedness among the beneficiaries. Samuel Moyn's contention that the degree to which societies have learned to emotionally identify with the plight of strangers accounts for the success of modern sentimental humanitarianism, but dismisses the flip side, that those strangers are saddled with sometimes overt, sometimes implied expectations of repayment. The crew of the Tiger was well aware of these terms and paid a very high price indeed. Their defense of Russia made British audiences question their patriotism, if not intelligence, for letting themselves be manipulated in this way. Lieutenant Royer's career in the Royal Navy came to a premature end as a result. As Linda Fester trenchantly points out in connection with the anti-slavery campaign of the early 19th century, contemporary humanitarianism suffered from the defect that it granted only a diluted form of humanity grounded in pain and victimhood. The restrictions placed on the expression of alternative emotions thereby also made it difficult to envision the repayment of the gift of compassion in different ways. My colleague Holly will next explore how the dilemmas of humanitarianism towards wounded enemies played out in the later 19th century. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And what we've suggested is that if we pass straight to Holly for her part of the talk, and then we'll have questions and answers at the end of Holly's talk, if that's okay, directed at both of tonight's speakers. So Holly, over to you.
Thank you. Sorry, taking an age to unmute there. Still getting better at this. Thanks all for coming, and thank you, Jasper, for a really fascinating talk. I think we've got a few areas of overlap, and I'll try to reflect on those as we go, and we can do some more of that in questions. So I'm going to begin in the Crimea, and by the end of the paper, set up some comparisons between a press celebration of humanitarianism in the Crimea and a contrast with a scandal about the treatment of the enemy at the end of the 19th century. So to begin, in the immediate aftermath of the 1854 Battle of Alma, with the figure Dr. James Thompson and his soldier servant John McGrath. Together, they volunteered to remain behind the departing British forces to treat some 750 wounded Russians left there. Thompson and McGrath spent 3 days and nights in hostile territory in the absence of any substantial supplies, spending most of their time separating the dead from the wounded, burying or at least covering about 200 and finding food. 342 Russians survived to be evacuated by boat and used in an exchange of prisoners. The last 40 casualties were left behind due to the advancement of a large Russian force during the final part of the removal. Soon afterwards, Thompson succumbed to cholera, dying, as the inscription on his 50-foot monument puts it, and we see that there, from the effects of excessive hardship and privation. McGrath, his servant, survived. I want to think a little bit about why it was that this generous action was so widely celebrated in the British press, Parliament and pulpits, who held up Thompson as a self-sacrificing humanitarian Christian hero. I think that Thompson's actions become part of the conversation about the extent to which civilized, humane war is possible. Advances in treatment of one's own and enemy troops are major ways in which war has been presented as humane from the Crimean War period to the present. Discussions of Thompson's willingness to treat his country's enemy also speak to wider debates, which I think continue urgently now, about the otherness or similarities of the other side and how far the enemy might be held in crossed lines brotherhood of shared suffering. And I'd just like to say a huge thank you to colleagues at Military Medical Museum who helped me to find a wealth of information around Thompson, and to Pete Starling, who as soon as I began to talk to him about my Enemy Encounters project said, do you know about James Thompson, and really flagged to me what a significant figure he could be for my research. Accounts of Thompson's heroism in the British press typically contrasted his behaviour to the Russian enemy, who were widely presented as violent and brutish. And Jasper did ask me, as we were thinking about how our talks might speak to each other, whether I'd come across anything about the Tiger in reports about Thompson's action and the need for a kind of reciprocity of humanitarianism. And actually, I haven't spotted that at all. I'll keep looking, because I think you're absolutely right that in some ways, part of this action was pragmatic, that by saving these men, the British were later able to exchange them in a prisoner exchange, and flagged to the Russian General Annenkov that the naval captain described the exchange of prisoners as a humanitarian act. Annenkov didn't agree, because the prisoners were in such terrible condition, perhaps not realizing the really woeful state of British wounded at the time as well, that it wasn't that the Russians had been treated worse particularly, it was just that none of the wounded were in great shape. So I think there is that pragmatic and strategic eye to reciprocity of humanitarianism. And there's also something happening importantly, I think, about claiming civilized war, which is why there's such a marked contrast, I think, in British reports between British gentle humanitarian behaviour and Russian violence or bestiality. So let's have a look at the way flamboyant reporter William Howard Russell, who Jasper also mentioned, wrote about this incident. Russell starts off saying, "We've lately been told again and again that the increased civilization and humanity of modern times will greatly mitigate the horrors of war." He presents Thompson's actions as sure proof of this, contrasting his behaviour to the Russians, who were characterised as brutish killers rather than preservers of prisoners. And this is how Russell continues with humanitarianism claimed as a badge of national pride. "I felt proud of my country when I saw little groups of English soldiers tenderly nursing wounded and dying Russians on the field of Alma the day after the battle, particularly when my indignation was hardly calmed at the well-proved stories of ferocious feeling manifested by some of these same wounded. In several instances, they treacherously fired at or stabbed the doctor who had just dressed their wounds, or the kind Samaritan who had slaked their parched throats with a draught of water. thus showing all the inextinguishable hatred of dying wild beast and none of the chivalry of civilized soldier. And in the accounts I look at from the later 19th century, later on in the paper, we see that same kind of rhetoric, in this case of a Black Sudanese enemy in the Sudan campaign, as wild beasts rather than the chivalry of civilized soldiers, which Russell sees as solely the preserve of the British. So there was a big debate about the behavior of wounded Russians after battles. How far were they really firing on the British who set out to aid them? Mixed reports, some saying that some of terrible violence towards those attempting to help, as Russell says here, and others talking about the great gratitude they met from the Russians who could hardly be prevented from parting with all of their money and taking off their crucifixes in thanks to those coming to help them. So really mixed accounts, and presumably reflecting a very mixed picture of behavior on the battlefields. Whether, though, the Russians were presented as violent or brutish or grateful and pitiable, British soldiers and the British Army Medical Services were held up as the benevolent, kind Samaritans of the story, and Thompson exemplified this. A few more examples of the way that Thompson was celebrated. The Witness newspaper of the Free Church of Scotland held Thompson up as an example of, quote, what honour awaits in a Christian country, the high virtue of doing good to one's enemies, and of the sacrifice, be it necessary, of dying for them. It is not often that the dark history of war is lightened, the Witness newspaper continues, by so bright an incident as that which formed the closing one in the life of Dr. Thompson. A sermon of the Reverend at Trinity College, Dublin, asked, shall we not celebrate from a Christian pulpit a conspicuous product of Christian heroism and compassion? Celebrating Thompson as, quoting here, enjoined by no mere sense of military duty, prompted by naught save the impulse of disinterested pity. So today I want to move on to compare the celebration of Thompson to a very different media storm about the British Army's medical treatment of its enemies, which erupted at the end of the 19th century. Some positioning for the Battle of Omdurman in the Sudan in 1898. And this battle caused a public debate about the treatment of the wounded. It may be that we have Sudan campaign experts amongst us, in which case, forgive me for this incredibly potted history, but just to position this a bit, the Battle of Omdurman ended 13 years of Mahdist rule in Sudan and was followed by Anglo-Egyptian colonization of the country. The battle ended the Mahdist revolution with around 25,000 Mahdists killed and wounded, while the combined British-Egyptian force lost only 43 dead, with 382 wounded. This campaign was particularly emotional, I think, in the British press, because it was presented as an opportunity to avenge the death of General Gordon at his besieged garrison in Khartoum at the hands of the Mahdi in 1884. And there was a powerful rhetoric of vengeance. Several eyewitness accounts talk about the general philosophy of the battle as to avenge Gordon, and General Kitchener's direct encouragement that this was a battle to restore British pride. I think those statistics of the 25,000 enemy forces versus the 43 dead of the Allied might call into question that presentation of the battle in the British press and to its military as just vengeance for the death of General Gordon. Ernest Bennett, a war correspondent for the Westminster Gazette, embedded with the Allied British Egyptian Army for the battle, wrote a piece for the Contemporary Review in January 1899, which detailed how the British both killed wounded enemies after the battle and left them without medical attention on the scorching battlefield to slowly expire. In exposing the British violence to the wounded enemy, Bennett reminds his readers of the specific stipulation of the Geneva Convention, which Britain had signed in 1865, Article 6. Wounded or sick soldiers should be brought in and cared for to whatever nation they belong. He notes that these provisions need not be observed in wars with non-signatory enemies, and asks how far the moral principles behind Geneva should apply in wars with what he calls uncivilized or savage nations. To assert that because dervishes or Zulus never signed the Geneva Convention or the projet of the Brussels Conference, we are at liberty to pillage their villages after surrender or to kill their unarmed wounded is simply monstrous. But you can see that Bennett's view was less commonsensical than it might now feel to us in the 21st century. Bennett Burley's riposte below was one of many. Bennett was publicly pilloried, really, for his position in After Omdurman and his exposure of British war crimes there. Bennett Burley wrote one of the fiercest rejoinders, but he doesn't deny that these atrocities happened. He does question their scale, though, saying quite casually that there may have been one or two instances of cruelty practiced on the battlefield is possible, as something of the kind always takes place in warfare, as in everyday life. Instead, though, he disputes the internationalist humanitarianism of Bennett's call for the implementation of Geneva beyond its European signatories. That's the quote we have here. To set up a pretext that such monsters are entitled to the grace and consideration of the most humane laws is to beggar common sense and yap intolerable humbug. Yet British self-respect was such that the dervishes were treated as men and not as wild beasts. Quite a lot of interesting thinking behind that idea, I think, that as if to suggest that to treat the modest enemy as wild beasts would be appropriate, but it was the British ideas of civility or self-respect that prevented this. In Ernest Bennett's very different definition of the monstrous as inhumanity to one's enemies, he queries the designation of the modest enemy as such monsters through moving individualized accounts of their suffering. Having described the majority of killing of the wounded as carried out by the Allied Egyptian forces and the Sudanese soldiers working for the British and Egyptian armies, he hones in on examples of British soldiers' brutality. And it may be his powerful emotional reaction to witnessing a British soldier killing a wounded enemy that inspired his controversial exposure of British war crimes. And I'm sorry, possibly earlier in this paper, I should have given a bit of an atrocity warning, certainly for this next quotation, just to alert you to that. Bennett recalls, I noticed a fine old dervish with a grey beard who, disabled by a wound in his leg, lay prostrate beside a small bush about 8 yards behind his son, a boy of 17, whose right leg had also been lacerated by a bullet. Neither the father nor the son had any weapons at all, yet a Highlander stepped out of the ranks and drove his bayonet through the old man's chest. The victim of this needless brutality begged in vain for mercy and clutched the soldier's bayonet, reddening his hands with his own blood in a futile attempt to prevent a second thrust. As the soldier was driving his Lee Metford bayonet through the old man's body, the son raised himself and gazed with dilated eyes on the cold-blooded butchery of his father. He clasped his hands together in suppliant fashion, expecting no doubt the same treatment. 2 soldiers from another battalion gave some biscuit and water to the boy, who, to show his gratitude, offered them his blue and white gibber. He placed his hand in mine and asked why his father had been killed. I had no answer to give, but he limped beside me for a mile when he quite properly was sent to join a batch of prisoners who had been captured and were being taken into Omdurman. Bennett's language here is notably free of the racist divisive terms of imperialism, which he does use elsewhere in the article. Instead, languages of racial difference are replaced by an emphasis on categories familiar to his British readers: youth, age, and familial relationship. In the various European conflicts I've looked at, sympathetic responses to the enemy are often articulated in relation to very young or older grey-bearded soldiers. The descriptors fine old man and the repetition of boy, with the son's age given as 17, exacerbate the details of the atrocity, as the young and old are widely recognised as deserving of care and mercy. Bennett is unequivocal about the ethics of this action. He calls it a needless brutality, cold-blooded butchery, in which appeals for mercy are vain. Appallingly, the son must witness this at very close hand, gazing with dilated eyes on the murder of his father. The son goes on to make direct physical contact with Bennett, placing, quote, his hand in mine and talking with him, asking why his father was killed. I find this intimate encounter a surprising and moving one. I really wasn't expecting to come across it in accounts of a battle known for British atrocities, with an enemy so broadly usually described in racist and Islamophobic terms in the British sources. I wanted to find out how unusual Bennett's experience was, and discovered that other first-hand reports do similarly express sorrow at the plight of the wounded and an effort to respond to it. A young Winston Churchill, a cavalry officer in the Sudanese campaign, described going over the field 3 days after the Battle of Omdurman with a colleague and giving small amounts of the water they had with them to the many wounded they encountered until it was all gone. And Churchill records, "It would have been a grateful sight to see a large bucket of clear, cool water placed before each shaking, feverish figure." At one point, Churchill's companion, Lord Tullibardine, even carries out some extempore surgery, though I'm not sure about the actual humanitarian content of this action, as none of the Mahdi were taken into the Anglo-Egyptian field hospitals, although Bennett does say they had plenty of capacity, and the low numbers of Allied wounded suggest they would have. This is the interesting illustration that Churchill uses to accompany this description of his trip out onto the field 3 days after the battle, where they come across this Sudanese soldier. He was shot through both legs. The bullet, a Martini Henry bullet, had lodged in the right kneecap. The whole limb was stiffened. We gave him a drink. You would not think such joy could come from a small cup of water. Tullibardine examined his injury. Presently, he pulled out his knife and, after much probing and cutting, extracted the bullet with the button hook. I have seen and shall perchance see again a man with a famous name worse employed, Churchill says, and that's all we learn of what happens to this man, unfortunately. Interestingly, I think in the illustration, we don't get to see his face. We only see the sort of the extended limbs of this Mahdist force enemy. Churchill's close encounter with the wounded and dead after the battle results in his reflection. Here was nothing dulce decorum est about the dervish dead, nothing of the dignity of unconquerable manhood, all was filthy corruption, yet these were as brave men as ever walked the earth. The conviction was borne in on me that their claim beyond the grave in respect of a valiant death was not less good than that which any of our countrymen could make. These reflections appeared in the first edition of Churchill's memoir, The River War of 1899. He removed them and the accounts of the enemy wounded in the second 1902 edition, which now means it's very difficult. You have to go to a research library to get the 1899 edition, because all of the digitized versions have taken the later amended edition. Churchill realized that material in which he was critical of the army under the command of the influential Herbert Kitchener, and sentiments found anti-patriotic by his readers, could potentially injure his political career. Churchill also removed an extraordinary account of the discovery of a Sudanese baby in his camp. And I want to finish with two examples, this Sudanese baby and looking back to the Crimea, to another kind of extraordinary children in battle account. I want to compare Churchill's reaction to this infant to a strikingly different approach to enemy children adopted in the case of so-called Alma and Omdurman in the Crimean War. And I compare these to draw together some thoughts on how feeling for the enemy and ideas about humanitarian responsibility for military enemies were structured by race and an imperial belief in white supremacy. This is Alma and Omdurman, Roger Fenton's fascinating photograph of them with Colonel Brownrigg, who took them in when they were captured out nutting. Fenton said in a letter to his wife home, there are two boys here, Alma and Omdurman, such are their new names. One is an orphan, the other has or had his parents in the town. They went out nutting last autumn and were taken, cried sadly, but would cry now to go back. And in fact, they never did go back. They were brought to England, educated, and went on to be upstanding members of their communities with full British citizenship. In a really incredible turn of events, this came to light again, and this photograph raised another kind of public response when it was republished in a book on Victoria just immediately after her death in 1901, Victoria's Life and Empire, edited by the Marquis of Lorne. And the boy Omdurman's family spotted it. Their father, who was going by the name of Simon Sinker, still carrying the sound of Omdurman in the name he'd adopted, was then interviewed by the Daily Mail about his life. And I don't have enough time here to go into the fascinating details of like how he'd moved from Russian battlefield to British family making. He had a large family in Britain. But I think it's very interesting that the particular details of Omdurman's interview with the Daily Mail that were picked up and reprinted across the British press were to do with this very comforting narrative of how British soldiers treated their prisoners. This was particularly pertinent in the context of 1901, where there was also a widespread critique within Britain of the brutal British policies of scorched earth and concentration camps being used in the Second Anglo-Boer or South African War. Counter to that, Omdurman, or Simon Sinker, said, remembered, the English soldiers were more than kind to us. I don't know how Englishmen, whether pro-Boer or not, can bring charges of brutality against English soldiers. They gave us blankets and food and looked after us. So I'd like to compare that to Churchill's story of finding a young captive after Omdurman. On night picket, Churchill says, I noticed among the horse's hoofs a dark small object, a tiny baby only a few hours old. Now he was a prisoner of war, yet his captors were more embarrassed than he. Perhaps had there been milk, we might have kept him as a pet to be brought up with especial care until, like a young tiger cub, he should become vicious and have to be put in a cage. But there was no milk, and we could scarce invite him to share our sausages. So Churchill spends some time, it's several pages in the memoir, talking about the dilemma of what to do with this baby in a camp with no milk and no women. And he decides, collectively, the decision is made that they will pass the infant on to a wounded Mahdist prisoner and send him out into the nighttime with a few ration biscuits and an effort to solve this problem. Having done that, though, clearly the event isn't closed for Churchill. He keeps thinking about what happened to the baby, and he has a long imaginative passage in which he imagines that perhaps the baby was reunited with his mother and became the king of his people. Or then more realistically, he says, perhaps he was flung aside by the dervish who was weary, in pain, and left to die. And Churchill doesn't really adjudicate on what actually happened, but spends time sort of speculating about this. I will go back to that appearance of the imagined young tiger cub as well, a different kind of tiger here, just as I close. The same attitudes about race underpin the British atrocities at Omdurman, made it necessary to ask whether Geneva Conventions should be extended to, quote, savage enemies, and led Churchill to imagine it inevitable that the Sudanese baby would become vicious. This prevailing belief system made it impossible for the British Army to treat the baby in the same way as they had Alma and Omdurman earlier in the century, bringing them home for schooling and to become British nationals. While in facing a white European Christian enemy in the Crimean War, Thompson's compassion was celebrated as exemplifying the civilized, humane way of British warfare. In conflicts with Black adversaries, the idea that the enemy are entitled to the grace and consideration of the most humane laws was broadly seen to beggar common sense. In my work, I'm recognizing these structures of racism that informed care, including medical care, across sides. But I'm also looking at those instances in which ideologies of racial difference and white superiority came under strain through direct contact, like Bennett's and Churchill's, with the suffering enemy. Thank you.